Thank you all for coming. If you're like me and you grew up in East Texas or had deep roots in East Texas, you've probably heard of Hendricks Lake and the story of the missing. I heard gold for years, then I heard silver, but I can remember my grandparents talking about the silver that was supposed to be in the bottom of Hendricks Lake in Tatum. And so when I began following Mr. Pinkerton's work with Trammell's Trace, and then saw he was going to have this book coming out about the lake, I was so excited that he agreed to debut it here with us. Mr. Pinkerton is a native East Texan. It says from Longview, but I just heard a while ago Henderson.
I was born in Henderson.
Grew up in Longview, and then went to Houston. But we'll forgive you. We thank you for coming. He's a native East Texan, he's an author, historian, and an independent researcher, which I, as a librarian, especially appreciate. He has been on, or are currently serving, on the board, the editorial board for the East Texas Historical Association. He's worked with the Portal to Texas History at the University of North Texas, and with the Handbook of Texas Online, which just yesterday posted some more information about this event and the book. So please help me welcome Mr. Gary Pinkerton.
Thank you very much. This is really a good opportunity to get this out and get it done. So when Christy called about this months ago, I had to circle this date in my calendar to make sure the thing was finished by then. So thanks to some of the people in this room, that got done, and it's been a ton of fun doing this. I do want to talk about a little bit some of the people in the room and this concept. Oops, I'll do that. Stop right there. Okay. If I hold my tongue right, it's good. Okay. All right, we'll do that. All right, thanks. Paying history forward is a concept I started talking about with Trammell's Trace a year or so ago, and the idea that I'm trying to communicate, for me, history about Trammell's Trace came alive when I learned that this rut across our pasture that was just a place to play growing up turned out to be Trammell's Trace, and you start to think about all the people that crossed across our pasture and bringing that to life. That's what paying history forward is. And so there are a lot of people in this room who have their pictures in this book. Brody Akins, Philip Waldrop, whose parents were key players in this whole story. Kay Vincent here, who thankfully I found through her nephew, I guess, right? There's a section of the book about the water bug, a tractor that floats on water, that proves that. We'll circle back to that at the end. So paying history forward is part of telling the story. Joe Brown in the back, you and Philip both spent time at Billsy Williams' house growing up and didn't know each other at the time, but have stories to tell about that. So paying history forward is about how do you connect people with the past so that it creates an emotional connection of some kind. It makes it personal somehow. And this is a very personal story for a lot of people who heard this tale growing up and heard about the legend. Somebody mentioned, Christy mentioned why I went to Houston. Well, you know, it wasn't really the intent at the beginning, but I went to Houston to meet this little girl from Carthage. That's my wife. Her dad was Billy Arnold, had an autograph shot. Her brother's still here, but that was the day she convinced me not to put the kayak on Hendricks Lake because it was sleeting. This is a picture of her on this campus as the girl fashion reporter, Stella, for the school newspaper, and the caption said, "Who could resist this picture?" And I totally understand that, my dear. So this is last week in Grand Canyon West, and I've got the index up there because if you look at the index for Trammell's Trace, it says, wife, comma, wonderful, see Hammond Mickey. So I call her comma sometimes just to keep her. But unfortunately, she goes by another name more often, which is Book Widow, which my mother likes to remind me of occasionally. But tomorrow's her birthday, and to celebrate, I'm dragging her to the Texas Treasure Show at the Carthage Expo Center. Just what everybody wants to do, right? So, in my mind, any excuse to have cake is a good reason to have cake. And so we're all going to share your birthday cake. We celebrate birthdays like for a week, so this is not. So now that we've got the cake out of the way, try to refocus. I know everybody's thinking about cake now, see. Let's talk about Spanish silver. This treasure legend of silver being dumped in the bottom of Hendricks Lake has been around 150 to 200 years. It's hard to document the earliest occurrences of it because there aren't newspapers, there aren't photos, there aren't things like that. But it's usually attributed to Jean Lafitte. If there's anywhere that Lafitte visited up and down the coast, known to have a place, Galveston, Contraband Bayou in Lake Charles, there's treasure legends. There were Lafitte treasure legends in Arkansas, in Little Rock. And they particularly exploded around the time after the Texas Revolution for some reason. But a lot of treasure legends attributed to Lafitte. It wasn't unusual for that to be. In this one, it said that he plundered the Spanish brig Santa Rosa in Matagorda Bay. There were several ships named the Santa Rosa. One of them sunk in Florida and got a lot of press back at the time. One of the treasure hunters actually wrote the Spanish archives in Spain and found that the only Santa Rosa they could find carried some maple-based liquor. But the story was that these 6 wagon loads of silver around 1816, when there were no roads in East Texas, were going north from the Gulf Coast to St. Louis for some reason, apparently because you could mint the silver there. That's a long trip when you have no roads, with 6 wagon loads of silver, but we don't let facts get in the way sometimes. But there were also treasure legends attributed to not Lafitte, but to Santa Anna. The story on that one was that Santa Anna sent Mexican soldiers, north with gold that he was trying to salvage for himself when the end was near, and they were heading north. Why Mexicans would head north is a little confusing, but that was part of the story. So Christie was right. It was either gold or silver. It was either 1816 or 1818. It was either Lafitte or Santa Anna. But the one thing we knew for sure, it was dumped in Hendricks Lake. That was the thing that was definite about it. So somebody asked a little earlier, this is hard to see, but Hendricks Lake is, oh, my pointer's gone. Hendricks Lake is right up near the Sabine River, right over here, right on the county line between Rusk and Panola. It's an oxbow lake, which it means it was originally the river channel and was somehow cut off when the river flow changes. But it maintained itself through some very nice springs that seep into it. And then when the river floods, it floods as well. Last time we visited, there were watermarks, 5 feet up the tree line where the high water had been. But it's just a beautiful place. It's been used over the years for a lot of recreation. And, before Rayburn and Toledo Bend and Lake Cherokee, if you didn't go fishing in the river or somebody's pond, you likely went to Hendricks Lake. It was treated as if it was a public resource at the time. Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Battery, who knew? This is a really cool map, and there are several of these along in Harrison and in Rusk counties and in Panola. This is an 1863 Civil War surveillance map that shows an incredible amount of detail. This is on my Facebook page for Hendricks Lake and also in the book. But it shows the lake there in 1863, but it was actually named Flanagan's Lake at the time, and that was another one of the major families in the area who had sawmills as well, but it wasn't even named Hendricks Lake back at that time. Or else the map maker just made a mistake when you're talking to people, you never know. But this road that passes right down next to Hendricks Lake is the route of Trammell's Trace. This is my mapping of the trace overlaid on that 1863 map. And so the road, which was the county line, passed just between the tip of Hendricks Lake and Black Lake or Black Slough over there. So the presence of Trammell's Trace and the mystery and myth around that helps support the treasure legend. There's an aerial view of the lake. Jerry Alton, raise your hand. Jerry Alton lives right there. Peter Walker Adams, that we'll talk about in a little bit, lived right there. And this is the boat ramp for those of you who visited Hendricks Lake in the past. I'll show you a picture at that southern tip of the lake. It's about 3/4 of a mile long around the corners, not very long. It's at its widest point, you can still probably throw a rock across it. It's an old river channel. It's absolutely beautiful. It is a treasure. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about how we might help promote that staying that way. But this is Hendricks Lake Road that came from Tatum, and these are all these Hunting Club roads that have been around for a long time. Just north of there, and on that map, was Ramsdale's Ferry, which was the natural crossing of Trammell's Trace, right where Harrison, Rusk, and Panola County touch. And that hard shell base there, you can probably guess what that is lignite coal. And so it made it a very hard natural surface. And on that 1863 map, you saw a wagon crossing, and Francis Ramsdale had a ferry there in the mid-1830s for a few years. And then there's a map out of the Trammell's Trace book. The star is Hendricks Lake, Trammell's Trace, the route connecting up with El Camino Real. So people who know the history of Tatum know this name. Paul, Uncle Fox Tatum. I think there's an Uncle Fox Park still in Tatum. In the late 70s, they had a flower arrangement contest for some reason. And the winner was somebody who created or recreated the moment when Paul Tatum decided that he could fly by holding 2 umbrellas over his head and jumping off the roof of the Tatum house. Like many stories, he either broke one arm, 2 arms, or both legs, you never know. But he was apparently very inventive. They called him a unique character possessed of extraordinary intelligence. I did find one patent. It was a rail coupling that he and another gentleman patented. He was a very intelligent man, and he used in 1884 that intelligence to focus on how to drain Hendricks Lake to recover the treasure. He didn't know about the Lafitte part of the legend at that time. He was acting on the Santa Ana version of that legend, but he decided with a group of others, one of whom may have been the editor of the Marshall News Messenger at the time, to drain that lake. And descriptions vary from 2 to 20 pumps in play trying to drain that lake. One description said it was a contraption with a bucket on a conveyor belt, so it would dip, dump, and after a month of that, there was not much happening. Springs were feeding the lake as fast as they would try to drain it. And it's a big lake when you're trying to, dip it. But that was his inventiveness in 1884. And so he and a man named William Downs were walking from Flanagan's Mill to the sawmill to Easton, and got into an argument about Tatum's attempt to drain the lake. And I'm guessing that Downs may have said something like what the Galveston News said about Tatum. Maybe he should transfer their operations to the Gulf of Mexico. A good deal of wealth has been found there as well. So they kind of made fun of him in what was a national newspaper at the time. And in this argument, Tatum beat Downs to death with a club. And then 2 years later was the postmaster of Tatum. So there you go. Can't find any criminal records about that. Don't know what happened, but that effort did not work out. He didn't go to the Gulf of Mexico. There were sawmills, multiple sawmills at various times, right on the edge of Hendricks Lake. They used the lake to float their extra logs, and In the book, I say the only treasure that was really ever recovered from the lake were those sunken logs in the 1940s that they pulled them up and milled those. There was a rumor that some fishermen in the 20s were fishing. I don't know if anybody in East Texas fish with a net like this. I think this is a nor'easter thing. That they pulled up bars of silver. I can't find any contemporary account of that. If they threw a net down, it probably caught one of these 300-pound gar that they, this is not Hendricks Lake, this is Mississippi, but there were multiple accounts. In fact, in 1885, a train from Longview with 25 people was booked to come to Hendricks Lake to see the whale, which was a 300-pound gar in Hendricks Lake. So a lot of things haven't changed. That picture on the left is from the boat ramp, Jerry. I don't know if you've seen that one, but the one on the right is almost the same spot. The growth around the edge of the lake has changed, but it stays pretty pristine. So in 1935, there's this full-page article with this great art like this on there, and it was focused on how improvements to Highway 43 had destroyed the last landmarks to find Hendricks Lake. So only somebody who doesn't know where Hendricks Lake is would write something like that. But if you live in Chicago or Illinois, where these articles were appearing, you didn't know either. But there's a picture of the brand new Highway 43 bridge, which is now, of course, the old Highway 43 bridge, that steel truss over to the side of 43. But this was written by this guy, Harry Reesberg, and in 1957, Harry, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, Reesberg had sold himself off as the world's greatest underwater treasure hunter, and he never got wet. He never got wet. In fact, that'll be the next book you hear me talking about, is about this guy. So he wanted us to think of it. This is an article from Popular Mechanics that he killed a 25-foot octopus twice. He sailed a 4-masted schooner with no engine directly over treasure, dropped the anchor, and went right down to a ship in the middle of the Caribbean. This is really who he was. That's his fake, you can't really see it greatly. That's his fake photo, as you can imagine, before the existence of Photoshop, gluing his head onto this person's body. And just none of the stuff he described happened. But in the late 50s, he was kind of hitting his heyday. One of his scripts became a movie with Robert Ryan and Anthony Quinn in '53. And so he was kind of, high cotton at that point. And he wrote an article for one of those treasure magazines called Sunken Galleon Silver, where he dredged back up this story of Hendricks Lake, retold it pretty much the same way he told it in '35, and published it in these pulpy magazines that were everywhere during the 1950s. Stories of the West, treasure magazines, things like that. And in true Reesberg form, once he found a good story, he couldn't find enough outlets for it. He put it in every magazine that would accept it, and even said himself he would pretty much accept whatever they paid him. And it was all about volume for him. So these articles came out in 1957, but they didn't surprise this guy. This is Philip's dad, Barney Waltrip. Barney was a TV repairman in Carthage, self-taught, correspondence course, we figured, right? Barney had been looking into Hendricks Lake for some time, and with his electronics expertise, had built some underwater metal detecting equipment. And so when Reesberg let the world know about Hendricks Lake, Waltrip was a little bit tipped because he thought it was kind of his personal secret, and he quickly, as soon as the article came out, tied up leases with some of the landholders at the lake for the rights to do treasure hunting there. This is another picture from one of the newspapers at the time. This is either the Watchman or the Messenger, I'm not sure which, but Waltrip had built some underwater metal detecting equipment, and that mask he was wearing was a World War II era mask that was the same one that Lloyd Bridges wore for Sea Hunt. That's the beginning of every Sea Hunt episode. I remember those well. So Waltrip had worked through securing treasure leases with some of these landowners. And these leases are, Rusk County has a great system, has all their court records, county clerk records online, so I was able to find these leases. And one of the first ones he did, this is the land where Jerry now lives, that barely touches the lake, was owned by O.C. and Pauline Pittman at the time. And Pauline was Adam's daughter, right? Jerry, is that the connection? And so Pittman was the landowner, but it was Peter Walker Adams and his wife Allie who lived there in that wood house. What a character. I would give anything to be able to meet this guy. Philip told a great story that when Walker talked to Sheriff Akins, if he would know anything about Sheriff Corbett Akins, he was a tough dude. He had a tough reputation, right, Rody? And well earned, right? And so Walker and Barney Waldrop and the sheriff were talking about draining the lake because they weren't having any luck. And it got kind of heated, and Walker said, no way you're going to drain the lake. And the sheriff apparently was getting a little, his sheriff genes were kicking in. He kind of put his hand over on his pistol, and Walker said, go ahead, Corbett, I'll cut your throat before you ever get it out. To the former sheriff, who took his hand off the gun. Because the family has said if Walker had his hand in his pocket, his knife was over. He was just a tough guy. I talked to somebody who broke up a fist fight between him and his brother when they were in their 70s. So, he was quite a character, and he was Frank X. Talbert's Texas. Some of you remember that syndicated article? It was the first thing we read in the Dallas Morning News, right? Was a big fan of Walker's. Walker got his name because he would walk with produce and eggs to Tatum 5 miles one way, pretty much every day, to sell that produce. But he was quite a character, and Talbert was a big fan of him. There were probably 4 or 5 articles about Walker in Talbert's Texas. But Adams was there throughout all these treasure hunts. He didn't own the land, but he certainly surveyed it and was the king of the lake, if you ask me for sure. The primary landowners on the lake and the ones who dealt most of the time with the treasure hunters was Sheriff Corbett Akins and Deputy Cush Reeves. Reeves was Corbett's deputy for a while and then became the chief of police for Carthage. And they co-owned about 470 acres that were on board on both sides of the lake that they acquired. So they had been very involved with the treasure hunters going on back then. Akins liked to be there as often as he could. This is a picture, I don't have the whole picture up there, but Brody, this is the one you gave me, I think. No, this one came from Tyler.
That's whiskey steel that picked up.
Yeah. So they busted up a whiskey still in the woods somewhere.
That's down behind the old jail.
The picture is.
And they hauled it in. Man on the left there is Mr. J.Q. Adams, and of course my daddy, and that's Constable Travis Gentry.
So here's the guy I want to know.
That's Johnny Roberts.
I would not want to be pulled over by him.
Across the river.
He what?
A constable across the river.
So his hand is bandaged, and I don't know if that's a chaw or if his jaw is swollen up. He looks like he either came from a fight or is looking for one. I don't know which.
If you want to fight, if you want to go to jail, they carry you to jail.
But he got some action that day, it sure looks like. So when that article came out in True West, somehow these two guys called up Harry Reesberg to ask about that treasure story. Andy Sorrell Jr. was a Houston oil man at the time. His father was in the business as well. His brother Henry on the left lived in Fort Worth, but was involved with him as well. And after talking to Reesberg about Hendricks Lake treasure, they decided that they were going to find it. And they had oil field equipment, they had different types of metal detecting equipment, and they spent more money than any other group had in trying to dredge that lake. They started in November of 1957. I've talked to Kel Jones, whose father, Casey Jones, provided the expertise and the dredging equipment to go out there, and Kel was there playing on the side of the lake around the same time that Philip was as well, and Brody. And they did their best to pull it up, but that claw bucket, when it hit the bottom of Hendricks Lake and that gumbo mud, it's just bouncing off. It's not coming up with much. Keldon mentioned at one point they brought up a pile of mud that had something sparkling in it. Everybody got all excited. They dumped it out on the ground. It was a piece of petrified wood from, it's everywhere in East Texas. It got those sparkly crystals in it, but it wasn't silver. 1957 and 58, every watershed in Texas was flooding. And so they abandoned their efforts and decided to come back the following spring. When they did that, they came back on the west side of the lake and built this pad out into the lake. That's a Seagoville pharmacist named Richard Carter, C-A-R-D-E-R, pointing at where they were looking to find the material. They came back with bigger cranes. They used Hathaway Construction out of Longview, I think was the one thing that they did. But this pad that they built is still there. This is the view from the water when it wasn't sleeting at Hendricks Lake. And here's what it looks like from the land. Still evidence of it. I think you can kind of pick it out on the satellite photos these days even. But in that second attempt, these guys were pretty much watching. Barney was there with the sheriff, Richard Carter in the middle, and a very cute Philip Walter standing in the back there. Carter was a dentist from Seagoville, but his family tells me he was really an adventurer. He took 4 months off to sail around the world. And he was a dynamite expert and a diver. And so after the Sorrells cried uncle and gave up a second time, probably at the urging of the senior Andy, counting the dollars it was taking, the best guess is they spent about $100 grand looking for the silver. Barney was convinced it was down at the south end of the lake, and so he had Richard Carter plant some dynamite on the bottom of the lake and blow it up. And Philip's sister, Diana, who was 12 or 14 at the time, probably, was the one who pushed the plunger. And so she's been gone a few years now, but I got to talk to her before, and she said, the game warden was there, Philip says, but because they killed a lot of fish, and so the sheriff and the deputy were there picking up as many fish as they could and fill up the boat. They blew a big hole in the bottom, but nothing materialized. But later divers discovered that hole. It had been a pretty giant hole there. This is looking toward that south end of the lake where that big hill is, and according to legend, this is the most likely place that you would think those wagons would have pushed off, but they would have sunk into some sandy springs right at the base of that hill and not gone anywhere, which of course ruined the legend. But that's a later picture of Walker Adams. I really like that one. You can kind of see what a card he must have been in that picture. So 57, 58 kind of did it. That was a big show back then, a lot of newspaper coverage. There were bits and pieces of other expeditions that kicked up in the interim, but nothing really spectacular. Adams himself said one guy, got all excited, made a big deal about it, came out and dug a 20-foot hole and then left, never came back. There are a lot more people who lake than will ever admit that they look for silver in Hendricks Lake. They would just come to pay the fishing fee of $1 or $1.50 and then nose around. So in 1965, another big expedition came up, again a lot of press. Scotty Stotler from Iowa and a group of his co-workers decided they were going to find it. And Stotler was a real grinder. He was big on research. He was the one that hired the archivist in Spain to try to find out about the Santa Rosa. I've got letters between he and Reesburg with questions that he would ask, and a letter to Barney Waltrip that he had sent asking questions like, does anybody know anything about those fishermen? Did that really happen? Testing theories, trying it out. They had all kinds of problems. A piece of equipment came loose and tore the top of a pickup off. Stotler hurt his hand. they still paddled around the lake. That's Stockton on the left and Adams in the middle of the boat that he rented them. And then in one of Talbert's articles, they said that what they found was basically a bunch of junk, metal parts. Remember that there was a sawmill on the bank of the lake on multiple occasions. So it wouldn't be hard to find a piece of metal. But they also said, oh yeah, we found this coin from Madagascar in 1299. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? So I tracked down Stotler in Iowa about 7 or 8 years ago, 3 weeks after he died. And I spoke to his son, Michael, who was also there and a diver, and found that hole that Diana had blasted in the bottom of the lake with a dynamite. And he said, oh yeah, one of the guys, nobody really took it as serious as my dad, and so they just threw this coin down the edge of the lake just to give him a rise. But it made it in the paper, and it gets repeated. That's how stories get told. But it was just a throwdown. Michael sent me his father's scrapbook that had all kinds of articles and other things in it, and let me take pictures of it and get it back to him. It's now lost. But in the very back, this just told the whole story of not only this treasure hunt but others. But Stotler, the serious researcher, the man who's going to find out all the answers, had written down the address of the world's most famous psychic from the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. So his son said he had consulted a couple of psychics in Iowa, but he was going straight to the top with Gene Dixon. The Ed Sullivan psychic, right? So there were other treasure hunters in there, and through these leases at the courthouse was able to track down family members and others. J.C. Gaunt, anybody from the Gaunt family? Oh, hey, how are you? Thanks for coming. You're Cindy?
I'm Cindy.
J.C. Gaunt was a dirt contractor, and the best we could tell, he was hired to build up a dirt pad for a water well type guy who went out and drilled a 40-foot hole and didn't find anything. The mud started getting rained on, and J.C. was afraid he would not be able to get his truck out. Sure enough, it got stuck, according to Adams. But a month or so later, Gaunt and another man from Overton signed their own treasure lease and went down there looking. Cindy, anything else you remember about those times?
Mom would be the one that would be able to speak to that. No, I think you covered it all in the book.
Okay, thank you. But it's interesting that he was using water well type equipment just to drill a hole on the side of the lake, and with it's a mile long, so it's about 2.5 miles circumference. It would take a while to punch a hole. These guys were really interesting. Is the fathers here? Anybody from those family? Giles Morris Leonards and Charles Fitzhugh Rice worked together at Schlumberger in the 50s in Tottenham and met there. And Bub left Schlumberger and became an independent oil man. Do you know that name, John? Bub Leonards?
I know him well.
Okay. John Robbins from Longview, who has been part of our family for a long time. My mom still works for him. This is my mom, by the way. What's your name, Mom? I didn't even introduce you. Joan Pinkerton. So Bub was leasing up wells in East Texas and somehow heard about the Hendricks Lake treasure. Fitz Grice was an MIT-trained electrical engineer that Leonards knew from Schlumberger. In 1967, Grice had gone on to Weston, which is a part of Schlumberger, and was head of a division that had an underwater metal detecting device, and in 1967 used it to find the Union ship Tecumseh that was sunk in Mobile Bay during the Civil War. So in 1967, that's what he's doing. In 1969, I talked to his son Charles. He was puttering around Hendricks Lake in a 6-foot turquoise fiberglass boat, dragging a piece of equipment behind him, trying to find Hendricks Lake treasure. For somebody with that level of expertise to be puttering around the Hendricks Lake just blew me away. They didn't find anything either except an old car hood. Although Charles remembers an X on a tree at the first curve, Jerry, where Charles remembers an X on the tree. So if there's ever any diving, that's where I would go. A later part of the story was with Millsy Williams, and this is a guy, anybody know Millsy? You know the name? This is another one of those characters I would have loved to meet, but both Philip and Joe Brown, Joe, raise your hand in the back. Okay. Both Philip and Joe Brown had, as young boys, visited Millsy's house out on County Line Road, south of Tatum. This is before Mark Creek Lake was built, and when the lake was built, it took much of Millsy's land. His house went away. And archaeological studies at the time have told us the extensive amount of Caddo settlement that took place in that area, all up and down the county lines, in fact. And a Cherokee trading post even west of Harmony Hill. But Philip and Joe, who didn't know each other, both told me the same stories about these Indian beads that they would pick up as kids. You know, bucket of dirt or the drip line of the old barn, go out and pick up enough beads to make a bracelet like this that Joe has saved. But Millsy had a theory, and in fact he told a story from his childhood that two old Spanish men showed up at their place at their farm in the early 1900s and dug some mysterious holes out on Martin Creek. That was their theory, that it was not Hendricks Lake, according to this map that these old Spaniards showed Williamson's father, but that it was on Martin Creek. And there were holes dug there. This was a newspaper article back in 1980 where the reporter went out with him and found a few shallow depressions. Joe, did you ever see holes? Did we ever decide? You never saw any different?
I can't remember.
Okay. But Joe did go out there in the 60s with his 1950s era metal detector looking for Spanish silver, just in case. But Millsy Williamson had quite a story to tell. Somebody asked earlier, well, where's the map? Well, it's on this grocery bag right here. What do you want, for God's sake? You got it? Hey, brother. Brothers McLaren from Marshall grew up knowing this old landman named Young Latham, and quite a storyteller, apparently, and roughly spent a lot of time with him, and Latham sketched out this map of where the Hendricks Lake treasure would be. It's hard to see, but it's right there, right there. No, right there. So the map is oriented a little oddly. This would be north, if that's he's called it Tramble Trace. I love that spelling.
I was 15 years old when he told me what to write.
Yeah. So it's somewhere right about there. Let's just go out there. Jerry, get after it.
It also says 300 to 400 barrels.
Barrels.
From something.
Right. So we'll draw a big circle and we'll just go to it.
Yeah.
But the fact that it was on a grocery bag just made it that much more exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's all we had. My mom and dad owned a little mom and pop grocery store, and all we had to draw the map on was a number 6 bag.
And you've held on to this for how many years, John?
Well, that was in 55 or so.
I love it. I love it.
I lost it for most of that time, but found it a few years ago.
And it's amazing. And then right toward the end of the book, I was looking for a way to end this, and it started with, in the book, I talk about one of the stories about Paul Tatum, was how he put his feet in some water cans and decided he was going to walk on water like Jesus. And Walker Adams told Frank Talbert this story. He said, Jesus didn't need no water cans. But that was one of the legendary stories about Fox Tatum. So I was looking for a way to end this story, and I got a contact from out of the blue by, what's his first name? Troy? Is it? Where is it? Parsons. What was his first name?
Wade Parsons.
Wade. Wade Parsons called me up, Alton Watt's grandson, and told me about his grandfather building a tractor, an amphibious tractor. And the story was that once Alton set his mind to something, you just didn't get in his way. You didn't even get in his field of view. And so in the coffee shop, he said that he could build something that would go on land and water. And so he got a Moline tractor, a couple of car hoods front and back, fiberglass and flotation. You can see the paddle wheel on the back there. And he drove that sucker out onto Hendricks Lake. And so it was a perfect way to end the book because, you know, even if Paul Tatum couldn't walk on water, Alton Watts could drive on water. So I felt like it was complete at that point. The water bug. It's got 2 seats, so I'm not sure anybody would sit next to him when he drove out of the lake. So as I mentioned, you know, the stories that these people have told, there's Diana and Philip in one of our earlier visits. Brody Akins, of course, has many stories to tell about his father and their ownership of the lake. And when they sold their land to the mining company a few years ago, they inserted a treasure clause, which of course, just in case, it makes clear that the treasure is going to be split 50-50. So nothing's going to happen, just in case there's treasure there. And Tim Burton, who's been a good help, who works for the mining company and your friendly neighborhood landman, been a part of the mining and knows all the landowners in the story. It's been a huge help in getting in there and seeing the lake in the current condition and ownership. Joe Brown in the box, when I die and go to heaven, I'm going to Joe's garage. Stay down. With his half of his 50 Zero Fisher metal detector. And then Jerry Alton, who lives at the lake now, Troy Williams owns that little corner of the Pittman land. And Jerry, just about as good a caretaker I can imagine having, loves the lake a lot and appreciates the beauty and the history of it. And then Stella Weiser from the Panola Watchman here, thanks for being here. And Braxton McKnight, raise your hand, Braxton. Braxton and Christian, and a couple other guys, Christian Roper in the picture, are working on making a documentary about the Hendricks Lake treasure legend. And we're both working on these projects independently and kind of discovered each other a while back. So sunkensilver.com is their website, and they're doing some fundraising to help produce that video. That was a day that we spent at the lake. So I want to talk for just a quick minute about the future of Hendricks Lake. And this is a difficult subject to talk about. It's owned mostly by the mining company now, but it's still private land. Troy Williams owns the Pittman property, but it was treated as such a public resource for a long time. And in my mind, that the lake itself is the real treasure. And it's just difficult to understand how to manage a resource when these are 2 satellite photos 60 years apart. And you can see, you know, well leases and mining, there's just a lot going on. Mining missed the end of the lake and you know, the area directly around the lake, the mining's not even visible, but it still impacts it because there's no public access anymore. You can't drive to Hendricks Lake. It's because it's a private road, and it's because of this. It's because of all that lignite that's out there and going to be mined. And I covered in the book the differences between the equipment then and now. That's a Inslee crane and a drag line on the left there that was used in the 50s, and one of those big monsters that they use now. We were at the Grand Canyon West last week, and the scale, you can't really tell the scale, how big they are. So I put a circle around that little black tick mark person up next to that ginormous thing. I just can't even imagine how big they are. This helps a little bit. The dragline bucket there was, in the 50s, 1 cubic yard, and Tim helped provide this picture of the dragline bucket they have now, which is 77 cubic yards, or a couple of pickups, basically, would get in there. Now that looks like Tim, that's our pretend human to show the scale, but that's actually an ancient artifact. I don't know. That joke would have fallen flat if you weren't here, Tim. This wheel rim was part of the story back in the 50s, and so the story was in 57, Barney Walter pulled this out rather secretly, according to Walker Adams' wife, because they didn't want a big stir, because what's better to find in a treasure lake involving wagons than an old wagon rim made out of steel? And he said at the time that he took it to a metallurgist who said it was over 100 years old. photo in, 1850s or so. And there were several pictures of it in there. For a while, I thought that there were two different rims, because the thickness looked different. But there were pictures at various times of Barney with this wagon wheel rim. I guess it was egg-shaped back then too, wasn't it? Did it look like it to you? And in this last picture in the newspaper, his wife had written "closest to success," and I guess that really was. There really wasn't any other treasure that was pulled out of there other than chunks of steel. But that was a real prize. A lot of people wanted to envision that rim on a wagon like this, a cart that might have been more contemporary to the era. Actually, Mexican carts during that time, if that's what they used, would have they even had solid wood wheels. Wouldn't have looked anything like it. I've talked to a few wagon experts and inquired about this, and one of them, just by sending a picture of the wheel, suggested it was the rim off of a fire cart. And you can see the size of that rim more closely matches the size of the rim as it existed. And since there was a sawmill or two on the edge of the lake, it's certain that they would have had fire hose carts like this with a pump attached to pull water out of the lake. So it's likely that's what it is. That's the best guess we can make at this point anyway. I forget who said it. Maybe one of Adam's articles said that when they took these sawmills down, they just discarded things. So if there was a chunk of metal that needed to get rid of, they just threw it away. So there's a lot of stuff in there for that. So the lake's been drained, dug, divined, detected, dived, and dynamited over the years. And the only real thing people have found are occasional car parts. There was a car hood the Grice remember finding. We haven't tried all methods. There are still some things available. Anybody can make contact, we would appreciate it. But draining the lake would only expose the bottom of the lake. There will still be reasons to believe it's there. And it's the factor of legend. Legend is a powerful thing. It's a way to tell stories that don't require facts. So in the 70s, mid-70s, another newspaper reporter wanted to write yet another article about Hendricks Lake, wrote the Rusk County Historical Survey, the commission there, to ask about it. And at the time, they were doing some archaeological studies, and the report was one of the professors thought he found something that totally disproved Lafitte's role in it. Can't find out what it is. Thanks for coming, Stella. Disproved what his role was in, but can't find what that is. But in the letter that the chairman of the survey wrote to the reporter, he explains the role of legend. This picture of Maida Jaggers was in the front of I think it was the 1982 Rusk County history book. She was a giant of Rusk County history, and could move mountains and save houses, and things happened because Maida Jaggers made it happen. So even though Davis McMahon was the chairman, he definitely deferred to her in writing to the article, to the reporter. I personally hate to blow out of the pond the beautiful myths and stories that have been told for 100 years about Hendricks Lake. But as Mrs. Jaggers reminds me, we must be historians and not mythmongers. Nah. I get that, and I made every real effort to present this story factually and do the research around it and dig deep and try to translate some of those documents. And the facts just never fit together. And so that's why the book was titled the way it was. It's more interesting to talk about the people who believe the legend than it was to talk about the legend. You can only do that so long. So, Mrs. Jaggers, I'm sorry, but we're going to keep talking about the legend a little bit. So we balance that out with the understanding that there's a true history there, not just the history of the legend that's told in the True Believers book, but the history that's told in our whole area. That's part of that rut that goes across our property, and how that was used by Caddo for hundreds of years, and was one of the primary routes for Anglo immigration in the early 1800s. And so along the Trammell's Trace, next to that lake, Evelyn Corey Appleby, this is part of a poem she wrote in '76. And I'm not sure why the text is so bulky, but she said, you know, we're looking at Hendricks Lake and thinking about Spanish gold, and we forget to see these bold traders and lost traders, bold Spaniards, and old tribes that are the true golden treasures of our past. Right along Trammell's Trace, next to that lake, and which is what makes it such a special place. So I don't doubt that at some point in the future somebody's going to want to dive into that. We've talked about it in connection with the film, and having Charles Grice show us where that old saw blade that they found is located still would be a good place to start. But it's likely all that we're going to find is car parts. And in fact, when we gave a talk to the Russ County Treasure Hunters group in Henderson a month or so ago, an older gentleman came up to us and admitted that he'd been diving, and he got a hit on his metal detector, and he pulled up the old part of an old automobile radiator, and he said, "Now I'm going to leave that for somebody else to find." He threw it right back out, so that somebody else would have to find something for silver. So I started thinking, and then when I spoke to the group, they gave me this nice silver medallion as a thank you for speaking to that. So I think I've got an idea what I'm going to do with that silver medallion. I'm going to chunk it in Hendricks Lake, so that if you decide to go diving, you'll be able to find some silver out there. I don't want you not to find anything. And that because this is a quote from Sarah Bernhardt. Legend remains victorious in spite of history. That's the power of these legends and myths. We need to understand them as legends and myths, but it doesn't mean that we need to deprive ourselves of believing them at some point. So I really appreciate your interest. It's great to be here. Christy, this worked out perfectly to do it during this time. And birthday. Okay. All right.
Before we cut,
Since my grandma told me about it out in the sand hills of Beckville, I'm gonna believe it's still there.